So I sought out pain, fell in love with suffering, and eventually transformed myself from the weakest piece of shit on the planet into the hardest man God ever created. Or so I tell myself. David Goggins. Is David Goggins a Stoic? In this episode, I will be examining some quotes from David Goggins to answer this question, but first, a few disclaimers. I feel compelled to state that Goggins doesn't call himself a Stoic, and so it might seem a bit odd to ask this question, is he a Stoic? So I really don't mean this critique to be unfair to him, but I do feel that his philosophy strikes some chords that resonate with Stoicism and some that might go too far. So I felt that it might be worth examining. Second, it could be that Goggins is actually a Stoic because his response and what he does is specific to him. And this raises an interesting thing about Stoicism in the fact that it's very contextual, and that to live according to one's nature for David Goggins might mean something entirely different than living in accordance to nature with you. So who am I to judge? I can merely judge some of the things that he has said as discussion points for the general public. And third, I actually like David Goggins. I'm a fan of him, Stoic or not. So this isn't an attack on him. I also like Dostoevsky. I also like Tolkien. Neither of these people are Stoics. That being said, I consider myself a Stoic and feel like it's worth examining his philosophy against Stoicism. So, without further ado, let's get into it. Starting with the first quote, I'll read it again. So, I sought out pain, fell in love with suffering, and eventually transformed myself from the weakest piece of shit on the planet into the hardest man God ever created. Or so I tell myself. Does a Stoic seek out pain? The Stoic willingly practices discomfort as a tool for virtue. For example, the Stoic could challenge himself in the gym in order to train discipline, courage, wisdom. However, discomfort must remain as a tool and not an identity. Otherwise, we become detached and lose all sense of self when we lose what should be only a tool. So I'm not going to get too deep into this because this is the soul of the whole episode, but I will ask some opening questions. First of all, is David Goggins controlling suffering, or is suffering beginning to control him? Can pain be medicinal at one dose and entirely poisonous at another? And does this idea train courage, or is it just ensuring that he never feels safe? We'll get into that throughout the episode. Number 2, it takes relentless self-discipline to schedule suffering into your day every day. This is from his book, Can't Hurt Me. There's a distinction between voluntary discomfort and compulsive punishment. Engaging in things like a gym practice, exercise, training, this can be seen as voluntary discomfort. However, if you do it 10 hours a day and you are punishing yourself for eating a piece of cake or something, it can easily fall into punishment. Now, Seneca, as an example here, he practiced poverty. So he was a rich individual and he would practice living on very terrible food. And I say terrible not in the Stoic sense, but in the sense that it's very bland. Barley, soup, and all this that the Romans used to eat, and the Greeks and all of these ancient people in those ancient times. So they ate very plain foods, and Seneca had available to him lots of rich foods, but would practice poverty temporarily so that he would stop being afraid of it. But he wasn't trying to prove his worth through permanent misery. It's not like he's going out there and, eating dirt and drinking out of puddles just for the sake of doing it. He's doing it for a specific purpose, and that is to train himself to not fear poverty because he is someone who is rich. So the key point here is that whether or not scheduled suffering, as David Goggins refers to it, is considered virtuous, it really depends heavily on why you're doing it. If you go to the gym and you're pushing yourself really hard, really, really, really hard for a brief period of time in order to test your mental capacity and your strength and your courage, that's one thing. But if you're going in there because you're punishing yourself, because you're embarrassed about something you said at work, and you're going to go into the gym and you're going to teach yourself a lesson by doing, 20 by 20 sets of squats or something crazy like that, that is a little different. And so why are you doing it? The test is the suffering proportionate? Is it purposeful? And is it recoverable? Because recovery is also a very important thing when it comes to these practices. Number 3, don't stop when you're tired. Stop when you're done. Goggins uses this on his official merchandise. Now, this one is interesting because as a gym goer, this is motivating. Don't stop when you're tired, stop when you're done. It sounds powerful, but you have to be really careful here. What do you mean by done? You have to define that term intelligently. A mature athlete will distinguish between discomfort and injury. If you watch a very experienced weightlifter, what you'll see is that they have aches and pains all the time. But there's always this question on, do I push through the pain, or do I have to dial back my training, recover, maybe take a week off? And this gets down to wisdom. If the ultimate goal is for you to get better, sometimes it might look like taking a week off. It really depends. You could be overtraining. And so wisdom is really the piece there that's important to have. Obviously, it's Stoic. So a mature athlete doesn't just say that I'm going to stop when I'm done. If they're tired and if they're going to risk injury and they have a competition next week, why would they push through the pain? It's kind of ridiculous. Let's bring it to leadership. A responsible leader distinguishes fatigue from mission failure. So what's the fundamental problem here? Well, the problem is that the harshest voice in the room is not always the right one. Imagine you're sitting with two people, two friends of yours, and one of them is calling you down and saying that you're a POS, and the other one is saying, yeah, sometimes you do mean things, but you also have some good into you. Just because the friend is particularly more harsh than the other doesn't mean that they're right. And the same goes with you. Just because this idea of, well, you're not done, so keep on going. I don't care if you're tired. Well, it depends. It really depends. Stoic discipline in the gym, in hard training like Goggins is doing, it follows reason. It doesn't necessarily or automatically obey the harshest voice in the room. Number 4, Goggins says, motivation is crap. This is from an outside interview as well as the last one. Is motivation crap? Well, yes and no. Motivation depends heavily on mood, whereas character is what acts without favorable emotion. But discipline cannot mean treating every internal signal as cowardice. Oftentimes, there is valuable information in hunger, in pain, in exhaustion, in fear, and grief. One type of fool follows their emotions everywhere. Another type of fool completely ignores their emotions. The wise examines their emotions and ultimately acts from reason. Before we continue, a quick word about the Strong Stoic Notebook. The first edition of this would have just been released while I'm recording this on August 1st. You won't hear this episode for a few weeks, but that's okay. Stoicism isn't meant to remain an interesting idea. It's meant to be practiced. It has to survive contact with your actual life, your decisions, your responsibilities, and the moments when you would rather take the easier path. What I was trying to do with the Strong Stoic Notebook is to give you a bit more insight into that tension, how Stoicism reacts with daily life. And I talk about that a lot on the Strong Stoic podcast, of course, yes, but I cannot get into a lot of the nitty gritty personal things that go on in my own life for professional and personal reasons. This changes with the notebook. So it's only available to premium Substack subscribers because of that. So it allows you to slow down, learn from my personal experiences that I can't share on the podcast. If you do want to support the show, you can join Substack and subscribe to Premium. You'll get access to that notebook. But if not, man, share this episode with a friend. That matters so much. It helps the show out so much. Leave an honest review, follow the podcast, leave me a 5-star review, I should say, and share it with someone who might need it. All of the last few things are completely free, and it does help out the show. Now, let's return to David Goggins. Goggins says, I believe in the permanent fix. Well, what do you mean by the permanent fix? What does this actually mean? Stoicism would be very suspicious about believing that we can permanently fix anything, in particular weakness. Character requires maintenance, unless you're the Stoic sage. And if you're a Stoic sage, I don't know why you're listening to this podcast, because I certainly am not a Stoic sage. But character requires maintenance. The desire to eradicate vulnerability altogether can itself become a refusal to accept human nature. And human nature is flawed and imperfect. Don't forget, we are mortal, and we are all going to die someday. As strong as we will ever be, as much weight as we can ever squat, someday in the future, we are going to be, well, not so strong. We're going to be not so physically strong. We're going to be weak, we're going to be old, and eventually we will die. So what does strength really mean in the Stoic sense? Well, it means courage. It means fortitude of character. And so maybe strength isn't permanently fixing yourself. Maybe it's not this one permanent fix. Maybe it's repeatedly returning to your principles, the cardinal virtues, what it means to be a Stoic, what it means to be who you are and what you value. Goggins says, I don't believe in all these quick fixes. I believe in the permanent fix. Well, I agree. Quick fixes are not always the way to go, but I don't agree that there is such a thing as a permanent fix because character requires maintenance. All right. Goggins says in his book, Can't Hurt Me, no one is going to come help you. Now, this is a very interesting one. This can restore agency in someone who is feeling particularly helpless. If you are in a situation in life where you've been abandoned and you're alone and you don't have any friends and you consider yourself, in Goggins' words, a POS, sometimes just telling someone no one is going to come help you is empowering. Because it really puts the truth in the fact that, okay, I have to stand up myself. And it can restore some agency. If you're someone that's struggling with agency, sometimes you need to hear something like this. But if you take this in the absolute sense, no one is going to come help you, this can turn independence, which can be seen as a good thing, into isolation. And that's not a good thing either. Stoicism is not about radical self-sufficiency. If you open Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, you will find that the first book in that book is, in fact, a bunch of sections thanking people that contributed to Marcus Aurelius' life. And you should be able to, as a human being, think back on all the people that has helped you become who you are. Like it or not, you started in this world as an infant who can't really do much for themselves. And so somebody had to take care of you. So radical self-sufficiency is not really the Stoic way. Ask any Stoic. They appreciate being helped and they have gratitude for it, and they understand that we are just one piece of a greater whole. And so there's a lot working for us as well. So the sharper idea, the sharper version, the Stoic version, if you will, of David Goggins' no one is going to come help you might be something like, take responsibility for your rescue, but don't confuse receiving help with weakness. You can receive help and not be weak. Now, for number 7 here, let's examine the 40% rule. Goggins has argued that people often stop far short of what they are truly capable of. And he explains this as the 40% rule. What this really means, what he really means by this, is that perceived limits are often negotiable. And I've spoken to this topic myself, and I actually agree overwhelmingly that most people never reach their full capacity. I did an episode on this less than 5 episodes ago. However, there's a challenge here, and the challenge is that you can't teach people to distrust every limit indiscriminately. There's a limit to everything that you will do in life. Every one of us has limits. So the Stoic question isn't simply, can I continue? Can I keep going? Can I push through this 40% and get to 50, 60, 70? It really would ask you, is that the wise thing to do? What does wisdom require me to continue? And what does wisdom require me to stop? That's the important distinction. Because if you're in the gym and you're trying to strength train, as an example, you're not going to go to 100% every single set, every single day. That's just not how training works. You need proper recovery time. And so the 40% rule, yes, it's true in many sense that most people never reach their limits. However, everybody has limits, and just because we have limits doesn't necessarily mean that we need to push ourselves to those limits every single time. Number 8, and the last one here, Goggins says from the Outside interview, when you quit something that is meaningful to you, you will be haunted by it. Now this is an excellent paradox. The question here ultimately is, when is it appropriate to quit? Well, again, it gets back to the intention. Why are you quitting? Quitting because the work is uncomfortable. It actually can be self-betrayal. And Goggins does say something that is meaningful to you. Well, by definition of something being meaningful to you, you may feel that, well, if you quit that, then it is a form of self-betrayal. In a similar line, if you refuse to quit because your identity cannot tolerate surrender, well, that can leak into vanity. You can become someone that's actually vain because you cannot admit that you're overmatched. And the Stoic is very humble and willing to admit when they are overmatched by something. Sometimes endurance is courage, and that's why there's a lot of truth in what Goggins is saying here. When you quit something that is meaningful to you, you will be haunted by it. Sometimes you have to push through. But sometimes you have to end a pursuit, and sometimes that's a form of courage. I was listening to Mark Manson, and he had a YouTube video out where he was talking about how as you enter your 30s and midlife, you have to be willing to let some dreams die because you cannot live up to all of your dreams. You guys may or may not notice, you can't see it in the video if you're watching, but there's a guitar here right behind me. I started playing guitar at 9 years old, and I had the dream of becoming a rock star. At a certain point in time, I had to let that dream die because it just wasn't within my capacity. Now, if you were to tell me that that wasn't meaningful to me, of course it was meaningful to me. I mean, I've been a musician since I was 9, and I played at whatever venue I could, and I pushed the limits as much as I could. But ultimately, I had to accept that it wasn't in the cards for me. And maybe you will say, well, Brandon, if you just would have kept going, you'd be a rock star and you'd be singing on stage in front of thousands of people. Maybe, but maybe not. The point is that wisdom means sometimes quitting. And deciding when that is, well, that's entirely context dependent. So the issue is not in quitting itself. There's no issue with quitting in and of itself. It's whether the decision came from a place of wisdom or fear or ego or responsibility. So let's wrap all of this up. I'm going to give you a 3-part structure here. A, what Goggins gets profoundly right. B, where the philosophy becomes a little dangerous. And C, the Stoic correction, which I have done throughout the episode, but I'm going to wrap this up here, and then I'm going to end with the central Stoic thesis of this whole episode. So stay tuned. First of all, what does Goggins get profoundly right? Well, comfort can quietly shrink a life. That is true. If you lean into comfort, if you stay on the couch, if you never challenge yourself, you're going to shrink. And over time, you can become what Goggins would say, not my words, but what Goggins would say, a POS. The second thing he gets right is that motivation is unreliable. Absolutely. I've been going to the gym for a decade and a half or more, And I can tell you right now that you cannot rely on motivation. You have to rely on discipline. Absolutely. So he is right that motivation is unreliable. And he's also right that earned confidence comes through kept promises. There's this idea now that you just have to be confident. It's just something that you manifest out of nothing. And that's not true. Confidence comes through action, through keeping promises to yourself. And Goggins is 100% right about this. So those are the few things that I would say he gets profoundly right. Now, where does the philosophy become a little dangerous? Well, pain can become an identity. You can be the person who actually leans into pain a bit too much. So you're no longer engaging in discomfort for the fact of getting better, improving your character, and so on, but rather because you're, one with pain. Pain is now a part of who you are. And that's something called detachment. And you're not acting from a place of character development, which can't make it stoic. The second area where the philosophy gets a little dangerous is that recovery can feel like weakness. And I've struggled with recovery myself, and I've done several episodes on proper recovery. But the mature athlete, as an example, understands how important recovery is. They prioritize sleep. They make sure that they take deload weeks. They don't overtrain, because what's the purpose of putting extra time in the gym if you're simply going to get weaker because of it? And so recovery can feel like weakness in this philosophy, and it's not. Recovery is actually a strength. It's a very stoic thing. Number 3, self-contempt can disguise itself as discipline. This philosophy can encourage someone that really doesn't like themselves, and they're putting themselves through pain, they're putting themselves through the ringer, and it's just because they don't like themselves. It's self-contempt. And that's not the same as discipline. Discipline is doing something regularly for the right reasons with wisdom, not out of self-contempt. And now we get to the Stoic correction. What would the Stoics say about these 3 things? Well, number 1, train hardship. Yes, do hard things, do difficult things, go to the gym, but do it deliberately. Do it with wisdom. Don't do it just for the sake of doing it. Have a purpose behind it. Live an examined life, and part of an examined life is doing hard things with intention. Number 2, obey reason rather than mood. Yes, absolutely. Motivation, it's not that it's crap, it's that it's often unreliable. However, what should be driving you is reason and not necessarily another emotion, because all you're really doing is replacing motivation with something else, with fear of being a loser or whatever it might be. And number 3, preserve the instrument entrusted to you, your body and mind. Yes, sometimes it's appropriate to recover. You should treat your body, your mind, your soul in particular as something that's entrusted to you. You are a steward of these things, and you have to take care of it. And taking care of it doesn't necessarily mean always operating with the throttle down. Finally, let's get to the central thesis of this episode. If I could sum up everything that we've talked about in this episode, it would be this. Chosen hardship becomes strength when it serves a worthy purpose. However, it becomes self-punishment when suffering itself becomes the purpose. Thanks for listening.